Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Zenway podcast. I am Zenway, your host for this show. On this show, we talk everything about life, career, and tech. Today, I have a friend from another continent, way over in Canada, Montreal, and his story really brought him to different countries from Asia to Africa and to Canada as well. And he's also a fellow co-founder and chief operating officer as well. Prior to this, I had a chat with Jordan. We had a very good chat around the topic about chief operating officer, because there seem to be a lack of mentions. I guess maybe they're not as glamorous as CEOs, but obviously a very important role. So I wanted to really have a conversation with him on this, on camera at least, right? But before we jump right into it, Jordan, welcome to the show, and why not you just introduce yourself to everybody on the show.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me on today. I'm Jordan. I'm the co-founder and COO of now called LabFront. We specialize in digital biomarkers and specifically catered right now to the health research sector. I've been working on our journey from startup for just about 9 years now. So it's been with the same CEO, with my co-founder Chris. So we've been along this journey for quite some time, and I've also worked with your podcast host as well on some projects out in Singapore as well. Happy to be here and happy to go through some of this discussion here.
Yeah. Thanks, Jordan. 9 years is a long time. One of my mentors were talking about how in a startup journey, you're in with it for a very long time, right? And sometimes marriages don't even last as long as your relationship with your co-founder. So 9 years is a long time. It's a year shy from a decade. So congratulations on that. So let's start with your experiences, right? Because at the top of the show, I mentioned that your experiences brought you from Canada, Africa, Taipei, Boston, largely in the healthcare industry and the health tech space, right? Let's go through your memory lane a little bit. How did each of those kind of chapter kind of unfolded for you, right? If you could kind of bring us back to maybe the beginning of your journey, right?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm originally from Canada, from Ottawa, which is the nation's capital over here, and I went to university in Montreal. So actually, McGill University. I studied physiology, so on the health sciences side. I still remember the first class I went into. There was 600 people in that class, and they asked the question, and who wants to be a doctor in this room? And everyone raised their hand, and I was the only person not to raise, and I'm like, what am I doing here? And then, so funny story, after I graduated from McGill, within 2 weeks of graduating, I had essentially moved out of my apartment, left Montreal, and was on a flight to Ethiopia to start a hospital. What I said I was not interested in partaking in, ended up kind of doing that. So I ended up actually starting this or joining one of my pals, one of my good college roommates, as well as his father, who is a famous surgeon in Ethiopia. They were originally from Norway. They do a lot of charitable work. So they were in Ethiopia for over 20 years. The father actually grew up there. And we went over there, and initially it was just the three of us, and the whole concept behind it was like, okay, well, the father had worked across many different hospitals across Ethiopia, and they wanted to start up their own thing. But the problem is that they didn't want to do a purely charitable mission, because what they were finding is he was spending most of his time outside the country just trying to raise funding for charity, and instead of actually doing the work. So what they did in that course of action, what they decided to do was actually, well, why don't we start our own thing? We'll start up our own hospital, and that's what we did over the course of like 3 years. We started what essentially was you can say is like one of the best emergency hospitals in the country. It's one of the first international hospitals there in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And so we started that originally, and then during my time there, we had a hospital that could cater to emergency services or for any emergencies, but we had no way to get people to the hospital. So in Ethiopia, there is no ambulance system. There's no number you call if you have an emergency. So we were like, okay, what do we do now? So what we decided to do is we imported a couple ambulances to try to like run our own fleet. And at that time, we were like, okay, well, what's the most reasonable thing to do? Well, how about we just pick up a system from Norway or from Canada or from the US and just import that whole system, that whole technology into Ethiopia and kind of run our whole EMS, which is called Emergency Medical Services system with the ambulance fleet directly. So I had gone to Ottawa to the National EMS Center and talked to the heads there, said like, hey, like teach me everything you need to know, what I need to know to like run a EMS system, having no knowledge in this at all. Try to bring that technology back to Ethiopia, tried it within a week, just completely failed. It just wasn't working. And the reality is that in this environment, there were so many, I'd call it a rugged environment, a lot of unique infrastructure challenges. So you had, I mean, you were lucky if you got Wi-Fi consistently. Like power outages consistently going in, the networks, cell towers would go out. So how can you run a technology infrastructure system when the infrastructure you're basing on is so fluctuating? So at that point, I was like, okay, well, we might have to just build this ourselves. So I called one of my college pals who was on the track and field team with me back in the day, and he was really good in computer science. And the reason I knew he was good is because he used to do all my university Comp 101 work. The only reason I've had that course is he used to do it. And that turned out to be Chris, which now my co-founder for like 10 years. So he was working at HTC in Taipei at the time, the phone company during its height, where it was like HTC phones were the top dog. And so we brought him over to Ethiopia a couple of times, and we built our own software platform to essentially connect. We had our own like little EMS dispatch center inside the hospital, which we had like a computer assisted dispatching system where you could see where our ambulances were located across the city. We could dispatch them to different units, and then we also had developed our own apps for patients to essentially they could just press on the app and it would directly ping their location directly to us, because another thing that is in the country, especially at that time, there are no street names. So how do you describe where you are if you had an emergency? So that's where the GPS technology was really in play. And this is just at the start when Uber was kind of taking off. So even before Uber really took off, or Lyft or all those ones, we're like one of the first ones. We're definitely the first ones in the country to do this kind of work. And anyways, long story short, we ended up creating the country's first EMS system deployed across the country. And yeah, that's kind of how we started in Ethiopia. And yeah, I don't know if we want to spend more time on this stuff, or we can move on.
I mean, there's so many angles I can go with this, right? But I think let's start with you studying physiology, right? What was because you mentioned that in the class 600 over people, you're probably one of the only, or maybe a couple of you that did not raise your hand, right? So what was the, I guess, intention in taking out physiology, right? Because with my previous guests, there quite a lot of them are psychology majors for some reason. I guess maybe because we're classmates. They all had a story, right? So I'm sure you had a story around why you wanted to study physiology, and it seems like the intent of studying physiology is to eventually become a doctor, right? So tell us a little bit about that, and before we dive into everything else, right? I'm quite curious in terms of your intention there.
Yeah, sure. So, well, it's pretty simple. Both my parents are scientists. So my dad was on the defense. He's a defense scientist for the government here in Canada.
Right.
So he works with all the different complex kind of systems. And then my mom was a nuclear physicist. So she was actually one of the first women in Canada to work in nuclear industry. And anyway, so obviously they pushed me into sciences, and it was just kind of my natural progression from there. Even though I definitely had I was definitely more pushing towards like the business side of things. Personally, and on my side, I didn't like the idea of knowing exactly where I would be in the future. I liked the idea of having a journey and just not knowing where that could take you, kind of being in control of your destiny in that sense. And to me, just the idea of being confined to a hospital was just too much for me. It was scary for me. So
Right.
that's kind of why I didn't. But looking back on it, it's actually a fantastic place to work, and I ended up working in one anyway. So it was silly thinking in that sense. But yeah.
I guess we all had our journeys where we had a preconceived notion of the place, and looking back, I think it's really by spending time trying to be familiar with the unfamiliar that we'll be able to find something that we like about a particular place, right? Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. The next thing I wanted to let's talk about Ethiopia, right? I think you moved there. You spent almost a decade there, right? Like think
I
about
spent 2 years in
2 years there,
2 years in Addis, yeah, before moving to Denver. Yeah.
right. And I guess what are some of the you've mentioned quite a lot of things, right? Infrastructural challenges to kind of deploy a tech-based kind of structure. You had to really make sure that there are different types of, I guess, components that comes together to enable it to work. I'm wondering maybe if you could talk about what are some of the, I guess, unique lessons that you've learned, right, from that region, and how have you seen it evolving over time.
Yeah. I mean, for me, going to Ethiopia was the best thing that has ever happened to me. Is a huge blessing because on a personal side,
Yes.
I got to learn very early on exactly what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And I was just like, I wanted to focus on healthcare, on technology, so in the health tech space, and I was very, very focused on the impact side of the work. So I really like being able to see what our work could do in terms of enhancing patients and the populations that we're helping. So just being in that environment really made it clear, and it really was a blessing to know what you want to do and be passionate about this early on in your career. It was amazing to have that experience. In terms of lessons learned, I'd say the number one thing would be, which is like important in any like entrepreneurial journey or any if you're starting your own startup or whatever, is resilience. So the concept of being resilient, especially in Ethiopia, I mean, fluctuating environment, not even just in terms of the technology or the infrastructure, but we're talking about constant government changes as well, especially during that time. I think we had gone through five different over the last like 6 years where we were still running the EMS system. We had gone through five different government changes where we had to meet five different new ministers of health and work and start from scratch again every single time. And so a lot of different moving parts. And I think the resilience aspect is like you can't plan everything. And going in an environment like that, it made it very clear that sometimes you just have to be responsive and just something happens and how do you respond to it, and that's what matters. And it actually comes full circle because that's a lot of what a COO does, especially in their job. You can't plan too much ahead. You try to, but in reality, it's very, very reactive. So that was a really big, I guess, lesson in that sense. And like, how are you dealing with failure and setbacks and being resilient in terms of dealing with those situations was big. And then the other part, I would say, and this applies to any kind of product development or if you're creating a product or anything, is the needs to whatever you're creating needs to benefit all stakeholders in every situation. So especially in some of the healthcare solutions like we're building and you were building at Thoughtful, it's been like there's so many different stakeholders that are part of it. So in our group right now, we have like researchers, we have doctors, we have patients, and so many. And in your case, sometimes you even had insurance companies getting involved as well. And I think in my experience dealing with the situation that was in Ethiopia, that was the lesson I learned the most. And the reason for that is when we launched our EMS system, we had proven it was working fully within a year. It was the first time since, so like we weren't the first ones to try this. The UN had tried this about 4 years before we got there, and it was a complete mess. It just complete flop. They spent millions on it. Our total cost for us building our platform that was supporting thousands of patients was 10 grand. That's how much we spent on building the entire thing. And it was just like obviously we pulled in some volunteers and stuff like that, but like that's how to show like how much you can do if you have a will to do it. And what we had found is that although we had a technology and it was ready for deployment, essentially what we had created was a technology where you could essentially deploy an EMS system in the most rugged of environments. So think of like anywhere across sub-Saharan Africa, talking about 1 billion people. A lot of these communities don't have these specific infrastructures in play. So how can you launch a kind of what we call a pop-up EMS system? So it doesn't have to be full-on ambulances. It could just be someone on a motorbike, could be someone in a boat. So like all these different kinds of situations. And that we had created this technology, and at the time we had gone to Geneva, we had met with the UN, and it had done so many different steps, and it still wasn't picking up to turn this into a nationalized program. And then parts of that were obviously a lot of stakeholders in play. You had the government, they have their own agenda. You have the aid organizations. It's a huge business. The UN, the WHO, all these groups, they all have their own agendas with their own budgets. So you need everything you do had to fit into play. It took us the closest we've ever gotten to turning our system into a full nationalized system deployed. The closest we had gotten was about 6 years into having deployed the official system. And the reason we had gotten it is because we had slowly learned this lesson of getting everyone involved. We had gotten the Minister of Health on board. We had gotten their number 2, their number 3 on board. We had gotten the Prime Minister on board in Ethiopia. We had gotten the WHO on board. And most importantly was whenever you're deploying something like this, who's paying for it, right? The country can't afford it. So who's paying for it? So we had gotten the, who have we gotten? The monetary fund to the International Monetary, the IMF, to essentially fund the entire thing. And we came in there and said, look, we have the technology, we have the know-how, we have the funding to deploy this. All we need is just the people to accept it. And the heads accepted it, but it actually, like, when you go down to that 5th, 6th, 7th in line in those government positions, turns out they ask themselves, well, what am I getting? Right? It's like, it's not enough just to fulfill your job. They're trying to think of their career aspirations as well. So in our case, it was like we had gotten so many things ready in the stakeholder position, but we still were missing a couple parts, and it never got fully nationalized in that sense. So anyways, that's a bit of background on like why I think that was so important.
Yeah. I think there's so many lessons to be learned about that, right? I think about such deployment, Malaysia itself, we've gone through 3 to 4 government change in the last 5 years as well. And I've heard about, friends who are working in the industry to kind of change various aspects of the country for the better, right? They describe the same challenge as you as well, right? Stakeholder changes, you almost have to do the thing that you do, right? Going to the second, the third level, second in command, third in command, those that are unlikely to be changed due to political changes as well, right? Those stakeholders has to be there, and it really takes years to do this, right? So I think the resilience part, it's no joke in this case. You spoke about something that really kind of piqued my interest is also around you mentioned that early in your career, right, when you went there, you kind of knew like, my goodness, this is what I want to do. Do you remember, the first time that thought came to your head? What were you seeing? What were you experiencing, right? I'm sure it's an accumulation of, various moments, right? But at the moment when you had that realization, do you remember what happened and, what were you experiencing?
I think for me, it was seeing the people, right? So it was seeing the impact of the work that was being done. And it wasn't me, like I wasn't the medical professional providing help. I was just helping this movement of my pal and his father's hospital, like just take off and build this momentum. But it was the interactions that I could see them having with the actual patients. And for me, I need to be close to the impact in order to feel like I'm participating in it. So that was a key point. And I think it was like, I have so many stories back from like those days of like you're seeing these like crazy stories of like things that I've never encountered being in Canada before, and you see all the work that's being done. And like actually, I'll give you a story. So actually, this is related to the stakeholder part as well. So like a lot of times what we would do is, so our hospital that we had built was a social enterprise. So essentially, it was completely owned by charity. But what we did is we provided services at cost, as the Addis is the capital of the African Union, so you have over 100 embassies being there. So you have all these people with health insurance, international health insurance, and previously, if they were getting sick, they would fly to Dubai, or maybe they would go to Kenya or something like that. So what we were doing, because we had finally provided international level health services, we could now bring in some of the higher paying customers. So we would serve them, and then we would use all the profits we would make to fund all our charitable work, kind of a self-sustaining system.
Yeah.
So in terms of what we were doing in that case, we would often go look for specific charitable cases that we could help out with. And honestly, a lot of times you would just, every day you go to the hospital and you see like people knocking on the door being like, can you help me? Can you help with this? I remember one time this might have been maybe like month 3 or 4 when I was there. We had just gone for coffee just down the street, and there was a little child that was just there, like disfigured. And a lot of the stuff that we would do would be, because we did emergency surgery as well as facial reconstruction, we had talked to this kid. He must have been maybe like 5, 6 years old max.
Yeah.
And he was just there. He wasn't in school. He was just sitting on the street, essentially begging for money. And we had gone to him, and obviously he spoke Amharic, which is the language there. So we had asked the attendant in the parking lot to help translate and discuss with the kid. And it turns out that the kid didn't have any parents. He just had an older brother. So we had asked, we told him, if you come back tomorrow at 10 a.m., we'll come pick you up and we'll take you to the hospital and essentially do the entire facial reconstruction for free, so you can finally join in and go to school. Because a lot of time there's a lot of stigma when it comes to medical issues where you don't look the same as other people. So he was ostracized from society, couldn't go to school. So we said, you know what, we'll do this and give this kid his life back. Yeah. And the next morning we show up at 10 a.m. to pick him up, and he doesn't show. And we asked the attendant, where's the kid? Maybe you should wait longer. And he says, the older brother of the child, thought that it wasn't a good idea. They didn't want to get him mixed up, because it was their only way of earning money, was begging. And that was the best way for them to earn money, begging, is because he had such facial disfiguration. So it was like, when I heard that story, and this kind of brings back to the stakeholder part, and been a lot of times, even when we think about building solutions in healthcare in the health tech space, we think about that end user, and we try oftentimes to put ourselves in the position of that patient or the person you're helping. And in this case, everyone would have thought, oh, what a great idea, and even we were so on board, and we didn't put ourselves in the position, framing it from their specific perspective of what does this individual want. And anyways, that's just one of the lessons that really shaped our perspective on it.
Yeah. I mean, healthcare access and affordability is probably one of the, I guess, quote unquote, wicked problems, right? And you being there, you see so much needs as well, and it must be on certain days discouraging, right? Because progress is slow, and yes, you see impact. I wonder, how does the team and yourself, right? You being one of the leaders as well. How do you kind of keep the morale up and focusing on the mission, so to speak, right?
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely in Ethiopia, that's my pal and his dad have been working at the hospital since we started 9 years ago, and they've dedicated their entire lives being there, and that's what's those are the true heroes, doing the work. They don't get any shine whatsoever. They're not on LinkedIn posting stuff. They're just in there doing the work, dedicating themselves. I think, in their words from chatting with them, it's really about seeing the individuals in the work that you do. Is always what the surgeon would always say, Dr. Shell. Say it's about seeing the individuals. There's an ocean of people that you can help. It's about noticing individual drops, those individuals that you're helping, and seeing how you can kind of create that impact from there.
Yeah. So that is such an adventure, such a journey. What brought you to PhysioQ, back then, and LabFront, right? What does that look like? Because Chris came along for the ride. and you successfully build it up, with frugal innovation with 10K versus the UN, the millions. So what happened
Yeah,
there? How did that chapter unfold, right?
yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, Chris was in Taipei at the time working at
Yeah,
HTC. So
yeah.
when we had built the system, we were like, okay, you know what? Turns out we don't need to do a full-on MBA, work in industry 20 years before creating something that can help. So we said, let's just do it right now. We already did it once. Let's do it again. So we had Chris's father is actually a famous researcher at Harvard from a center called the Center for Dynamical Biomarkers. We founded this lab. Brilliant physicist who applied physics into healthcare. So a lot of what we're talking about digital biomarkers. So chatting with him and Chris and his father a lot, we noticed that there's a lot of applications within the research world that would take about 20 years before it would actually get applied into the real world. It would actually get deployed in situations like Ethiopia or even in Canada or Malaysia. So like what we said is like, how can we shrink those groundbreaking discoveries into being deployable? And one of the aspects is obviously we saw the technology and some of the applications that the lab at Harvard could do. So we decided to go to Taipei because Chris already had a network of people that we could initially start up a team with, engineers, designers, all there. So we decided to go back go to Taipei in what was it, 2016, and build up our own team right away. At first we had tried a variety of different you create all the different products and whatnot, specifically around wearable devices, and you test, you iterate, you fail, and then you fail forward, right? So you end up building all these different solutions. And then we were doing some work in China for a couple of years, for like 3-4 years, essentially building algorithms for a lot of the wearable makers out in China and in Asia. And we essentially it's called like a dev shop. So we were building algorithms and analytics for other people, but we're still so far away. And we had our experience in Ethiopia. We're like, we want to be able to interact directly with the people we're helping. So that's where we decided at that point to focus on the health research element, using wearables, and all that stuff. Yeah. So that's kind of how we got to Taipei. And I was there for 7 years. We still have a team out there as well. So yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of the work that you do with in your PhysiQ and LabFront, I noticed that I guess maybe the business model is slightly differed or slightly evolved, I would say, right? And, how would you describe that thought process in evolving it? Because you mentioned it's a really interesting angle to kind of think about health tech impact, right? Because you talk about how you wanted to create impact in the health tech space, and the way that we can do this is to enable the so-called true heroes to deploy real technology in use case, right? So helping them to speed that up sounds amazing to me as well. So between PhysiQ and LabFront, if you can describe to the audience what's that difference, right? Because it seems like there's two entities.
Yeah, for sure.
What does that difference look like? Yeah.
Yeah, in our case, it first started as like, okay, we got a core technology. We have the ability to analyze all these signals, these ones and zeros coming out of these wearable devices, and translate that into health insights. So you can convert like raw heart rate data into heart rate variability, or into stress scores, into sleep metrics and whatnot. So we had this core capability, and we went through a variety of different business models. So at first we had tried, okay, well, how about we deploy wearable devices in healthcare settings to help with sleep apnea. And we had deployed it, but it was just taking so much time to get hospitals on board because they're very slow moving, especially in a lot of these areas. So we had said, okay, let's pivot away from that. And long story short, we ended up creating this platform called LabFront, which essentially is helping researchers collect all this different type of wearable data in their studies. So let's say they have 100 participants out in the real world. Instead of coming into the lab, you're getting one data point every week, and then you send them back out. This way, you could strap on wearables, collect 24/7 data for the entirety of their studies. So we built this platform that would help researchers collect and analyze data for their entire research project with our technology. And behind the PhysioQ LabFront, so this actually goes back to our how we had originally built the entities. So we were essentially trying to mimic exactly what we had done in Ethiopia in terms of using a self-sustaining cycle, using a business entity to further a charitable mission in doing so. So PhysioQ was or still is a nonprofit entity that we had registered in or created. We had launched in the U.S. We had done a lot of work during COVID when COVID happened. We essentially launched this like massive program across the world for COVID, early COVID detection. And what we found is when things really started taking off for us in 2021 in terms of like the business money coming in, where we have customers, we have revenue. What we found was actually the charitable organization, essentially the IRS, told us, been like, actually, you can't have a self-sustaining model for a charity, even though. So we had gone to court and everything like that, and there was no way we could get around it. So although we wanted to build essentially a charity, but with a money-making system in it to fund our own work, they said, no, technology can't be used for good in that sense. That's only a for-profit group. So we were like, okay, well, I guess we need to create another entity, which was essentially LabFront by itself, and it had to be a for-profit. And so we wanted to be originally a charitable entity, and then we had to pivot into being a for-profit entity, and then we had to go the fundraising route, get investors, and all that. So it's kind of this roundabout way of kind of getting there.
That's crazy because we talk about with my previous guest Pin, we talk about social enterprise, social impact, those kind of things, and I think she kind of alluded to when she was doing the work, right? The circumstances was just not ready in Asia. Maybe both from a infrastructure perspective, from a funding perspective, and so on, it was not ready. So I was quite surprised to hear that even in US, there isn't kind of like a system that allowed what you wanted to do, because it sounds like a very straightforward social enterprise case, right? It's basically just money in, so-called quote unquote money in, money out in just different areas, right? So it's really, really surprising for me to hear that even in the US, they are not kind of like quote unquote supportive of this type of model.
Yeah, I mean we've been working with the SEWF, so it's a Social Enterprise World Forum, for many years, and one of the key things that they say is that the number one thing that needs to happen across the world for the impact sector is to have clear definitions or clear entity styles or entity formats for social enterprise. So they have like the B Corps and all that course that they've created to try to fit into that model, but it's still really tough. Like a lot of these countries, like they don't even like even in Taipei as well, like over there they didn't even recognize the social enterprises. It was either charity or it's for profit. There's nothing in between in the US and Canada, so it's a real pain. So it's a bit sad that we're kind of at this state, and then if you go the for-profit route, then naturally you can't access any of the supporting resources that are available to charitable endeavors, even though that's what you want to do. So you have to go the fundraising route, and as soon as you go that, something called fiduciary responsibility comes in, and you have to make more money now. You can't just give it away to people. So it's something needs to change.
As you're describing the whole two entity situation and all that, I think my chief operating officer had just started to think about, okay, if I want to channel funds from my for-profit entity to my non-profit entity, that's going to be another tax issue over there. We need to think about all the accounting problems that we may encounter and stuff like that. Oh my goodness, man.
I knew you would appreciate this. So we have, man, it's crazy because we had 6 entities across 3 different countries that we have to continue. And it's like, there's so much headaches, especially on the COO side of like just bureaucratic administrative processes. And like one of them is in Taipei. We're talking like Asia kind of systems, and then we're looking at US, and then it's a nightmare. But thankfully now we've like streamlined it down so it's a bit easier. Wow. But yeah, it was a full-time job to deal with that.
Right. Before we jump into the COO conversations, I wanted to maybe just touch on this since we're on the topic of what LabFront and PhysioQ does, right? You're working with a lot of researchers, and we talk about how we're trying to really kind of help them propel their research forward, right? Have you seen any cutting edge research that you are allowed to share, or maybe past interesting research, right? That's using a LabFront or physical platform that you could share, right? That would be really interesting because I'm sure you're at the forefront of really seeing interesting use cases, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we see it across all areas of research. So, and it's cross spectrum. So, translational research is what we call it. So, multi different in different segments. So, you can look on the psychology side. Essentially, think about it. Then, like usually in psych, we're sending out surveys to people, so just subjective data. And now they have the capability through our platform of collecting objective data from biomarkers. And even though they don't need to be specialists in analyzing data, because we'll also do it through our platform directly. So we're now enabling them to go get objective data. So we're seeing this huge push. Probably around like 50% of our customers are actually coming in from the psych sector,
Wow.
coming in and just flooding into the research. So this whole sector is really booming right now. So obviously, I mean, we had a lot of cool research going on. I say the best one is probably with our partners at Thoughtful that we had. There's the plug. So we had a really cool project with your former team as well, where we had essentially used digital biomarkers to leverage and help out in Thoughtful, which is like the mental health telehealth platform, to help level up some of the treatments that you could do and help out the patients on that side, both helping on the patient side as well as the therapist side as well,
Yes. Yeah.
with some of the insights. In some other cool like psych related ones, we see some studies related to the effect of social media use on teen well-being. So you could actually
Wow.
track the use of apps like TikTok or Instagram and see how it would affect the physiology of teens and how it would help out on that. We've seen like PTSD therapy or the effect of PTSD therapy among like military personnel. What else? Let's jump over to the physiological side. Really big right now is actually the effects of long COVID. So the effects on the physiology of, or the effect of long COVID on the physiology is quite big right now. And then like we also have a lot of exercise science. So science of movement, a lot related to actually the impact of exercise in certain populations. So, for example, let's say cystic fibrosis, or even the effect of exercise for people living with Alzheimer's disease. So we have all these different projects going on, and like some of these studies are from like 20 participants all the way up to like 5,000 participants running in these studies wearing wearables, all being done in the real world. So essentially, the way it works is like a researcher hands out these wearables to all these like thousands of participants across the country. They use our LabFront app to be able to upload the data automatically from their wearable, maybe answer some questionnaires, and then all that data is nicely pushed over to the researchers to be able to view that in real time. And then a big issue in research is adherence. So like, are your participants doing what they're supposed to be doing in some of these interventions? And like being
they could
able
have took
to
out their watch, right? Because me, for example,
exactly.
I can't put it on the whole time, even though I have one.
Exactly. So how did, as a researcher, you spent millions of dollars into this research. How do you know that you're actually collecting data when they're out for a year, no contact? So in this case, been like being able to track that and then do the analysis is pretty cool. And then we launched our platform in 2021. And it's in over 100 institutions right now. It's really prominent in North America, and then we launched in Europe last year, and then we're just starting in Asia a bit right now as well. Yeah.
Right. And are you seeing more, I guess, more research around heart rate variability, right? Because that's what we worked on together in my previous organization. I recently I was listening to how heart rate variability, they were using it to effectively just manage stress and anxiety and helping people to improve their heart rate variability because it is correlated on how fast you can recover and how fast you can be able to kind of modulate your physiology, right? Do you also see a lot of research in the heart rate variability space as well?
Definitely, it's probably the hottest metric in research right now is heart rate variability, for sure. And like there are like common misconceptions when it comes to heart rate variability. So like, let's say you get from like your Apple Watch or your Fitbit watch, they say like, oh, here's your HRV score or your stress score. The reality is the sampling rate at which they're collecting the heart rate in consumer devices every 60 seconds. So they're collecting your heart rate every 60 seconds. That's not granular enough to provide clinical validated HRV. So like, although they claim, oh yeah, we're doing HRV, it's not a clinically validated one. So it's kind of like this consumer light version. So like one of the things we at LabFront, and what we did actually with Thoughtful as well, is we have the ability to essentially like ramp up the sensor frequency of these watches, collect much higher granular data, and then we can use that data to then calculate all these different types. So there's like 35 different types of heart rate variability. And we can do everything from frequency domain, like time domain, maybe some nonlinear applications as well. And essentially all these different metrics sometimes have some different physiological responses as well. So like definitely the overall, you can kind of sum it up as like stress, like your physiological stress for your body. Oftentimes you can also consider that as like recovery. So that's definitely one of the biggest ones that we're looking at right now, especially related to stress. Mental health is huge right now. And even in studies that used to do, or research that just used to do the physiological component or the exercise phys, they're now bringing in the mental health component as well, because you can now collect, like we did with Thoughtful as well, you can collect both the objective as well as some subjective feelings as well. So we're seeing that whole sector take off. So I think what we're going to see is a lot of the research that's coming out will be a lot more full. So one, it'll be way quicker to go from project creation to publishing, kind of like we saw during COVID. It's been like somehow research that used to take like 6 years was being published really quickly within 6 months. So it's been like, how do we leverage and kind of accelerate that process going forward?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's jump into the COO conversation, right? So we had a chat about this. I think we had a lot of fun conversation, I guess, related to one another, right? And it's over the time that I was speaking to another COO in another fintech over here in Malaysia, and he was essentially talking about the same thing around like there's just not a lot of support forums out there. But before we jump into it, for the benefit of our listeners that may not be familiar with, I guess the intricacies of a COO role, let's talk about what it entails, right? Especially perhaps in a health tech startup, for example, or maybe in a startup in general, right? What does it entail? Would you like to kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, for sure. And our chat was more of a venting session than anything else. I think. It was a therapy session.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
No, so I think the day-to-day responsibilities of CEO, I mean, they vastly differ based on your company stage, your sector. So I'll talk about it from my angle. So let's say the pre-Series A company stage in like health technology. So software
0 to maybe 50 to 0 to 50, 25 kind of size, right? Employees, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, I like to describe like this COO stage is really like the jack of all trades, master of none, right? So you just end up doing anything that needs to be done, and you don't have enough time to spend becoming a master at one thing. So as soon as you manage to just get something done, you move on to the next thing. So like things that we would deal on would be like anything from like, I mean, typical cases you could deal with like product development, marketing, sales, finance, HR, maybe customer service, and definitely the administrative, legal, regulatory stuff as well. In our startup, so in my experience, it's a bit unique because Chris, our CEO, is much more product focused. So he has experience on the product side. So he oversees all the product, the design, engineering, R&D bit. And then we usually historically over the last 9 years, we pass back and forth like marketing, sales, fundraising duties and stuff like that. But our headcount right now is like, let's say like 15. And in my side, it's been like anything administrative, 6 entities across like 3 countries, anything with like, I mean, you're dealing with like operational regulations, all that kind of stuff, it's a nightmare. Anything on the finance side, business or business ops. So anything from like projections to modeling, which is like at early stage, you don't think it's important, but as soon as you bring on fundraising or you're going for it, it's like, that's all you're doing is just continuously updating these models every day. That's a real time suck. And then definitely in our space was regulatory and legal. So it's super heavy in the health tech sector, especially in our case, because every country has different regulations. So every country so I was just looking at the other day, actually. So I was like, okay, we have the UAE. We had a new customer in the UAE. I'm like, what are the regulations, and I'm just Googling and trying to figure everything out, being like, okay, what are the tax implications and all this kind of stuff. So it's
Right.
like it's dealing with all these different things on a continuous basis. But most recently, we were talking a bit before this call as well. Most of my energy now that I've transitioned over to North America to really push on our sales and customer success, customer facing partnership style. So like a lot of my work is now focused on that. But
Right.
like, and I'm curious to know your experience as well. Like
Yeah.
my experience has always been, you kind of go through phases. Like 2 months, you're really into this legal,
Yeah.
or like we were really into like HIPAA compliancy, and then after
Yeah.
that we go, okay, SOC 2, okay, then we jump over to other stuff. I'm
Yeah.
curious on your perspective as well.
Yeah. I think it's similar, right? The first it's in phases as well. I think in the first year it was more because we have less than five during the first year, right? So we were five, seven-ish employees at that point of time. So I was quite heavily involved in the product aspect, in really just making sure that our website works, our app don't crash, working with the developers, also involved in business development as well, right? Supporting the founder in pitching and things like that as well. So I think the first year was like that. The second year onwards, we had a little bit more firepower in that sense, and we managed to kind of get in ahead of product as well, right? So my role then evolved a little bit more towards like managing more on the contractual side of things, so making sure that whichever deliver what we promise in that sense, right? In the summary, is really that when it comes to having new partnerships coming in, like for example the research project collaboration, for example, I've got to anchor that, stabilize that a little bit and pass it on to someone else. So I think it's really around traffic control. I guess the definition of a role in another sense is really traffic control and coordination as well, right? So making sure that there's no traffic jam internally, figuratively speaking. Third year was more around like really just, I guess I played a little bit of that role of what you were saying as well, right? In terms of being a little bit more involved in the BD aspects, right? It's really not my strong suit, to be honest with you. I can do it, but I'm not much of a hunter, right? So I can do pitches, I can really tell a story really well since I've been with the organization for so long. But not much of a hunter myself, but I still got to figure out, right, in terms of like what does a sales funnel look like, what's the conversion rate going to be looking like, how many leads are we getting, right? So I think my experience is kind of in phases as well, just like yours. I think to me the unique position of a COO, it's really being able to kind of look at the strategic aspect and just make things work, right? Making it actionable, making it executionable, and things like that. But the thing is that oftentimes these roles tend to be described as quite executional, and it's less strategic in that sense. But you have to be strategic. I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts around like what does the ratio look like practically speaking, right? Strategic versus operationally speaking, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely changes as you grow, or as I say, not necessarily like oftentimes we think of like headcount growing, but I don't necessarily. I kind of disagree with myself in that statement, because actually it's more been like, what are your priorities given at a specific moment? So like early on, it's like, okay, we're heavy on product development, and then like right now we're at a stage over the last like year where it's like very focused on business sales, more BD focused on my side. So you kind of like navigate these different roles. In terms of, and it also depends in like, what are your limitations in terms of resources? Because like, I mean, the reality is running a startup is very expensive, and especially if you want to build something, it's very capital intensive in the beginning. So do you have enough runway, and like, what are some of the limitations on the budget? Like, can you afford to just send something over to legal, but it'll come back and cost you $4,000 for one paper? You had already done all the work anyways. So like, and oftentimes, even now, I'm still like, no, it's not worth it. I'm going to review it myself and then hope for the best. It's like, it's just so expensive oftentimes to do these kinds of things. So like, in terms of day-to-day work, to answer your question, I mean, we would love it to be more strategic than operating. I think that's like the higher level you go, obviously you want to be more strategic, but in reality, especially in those early stages, it's like 10% strategic, 90% operational. At least like in my case, you try to take a break and then try to figure out, and like, okay, what am I doing? How am I going to do this? And then you don't have the resources to just delegate. So a lot of the time you just got to do it yourself. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think as I was kind of like reflecting on my journey and what it was, what does it look like, right? Like, what it can look like. Obviously, I think I've done what I could to help propel the organization to where it is today. But obviously, there are some limitations. Me being the first time COO, obviously, I was reading this book, called "Deliver What We Promise" by the ex North America CEO, Lego's ex North America CEO. He is the first, he's the first Indian national taking on traditionally very strong organization, right? And he was talking about how there shouldn't be many different strategies. There should be one central strategy, and everybody else role is to support that strategy. And I feel like COO a lot of times need to play that role as well, right? Because we discuss as a leadership team around what is the central one strategy, and the rest of it is really like how do we then execute to support that strategy as well. So everything from, like you mentioned, right, resource allocation and things like that. Compliance and I guess regulatory concerns are one of the big areas that we had as well. Like for example, our clients, like insurers and employers, they want privacy, data privacy, and rightfully so, right? So you talk about SOC 2, you talk about like HIPAA, which we had a conversation around. Those are enablers for us to do business, right? So therefore, we need to execute on it, and therefore we need to be able to kind of really just double down on these different aspects to be able to do the business. Otherwise, there's no growth, right? So to me, I totally agree with you in terms of like, there's probably 10%, really thinking about the strategy important, but 90% of the time, I think during the early stages, is really about down to how do you execute well and manage the resources that you have, right? I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Part of that operational aspect, definitely in my case, because once again, it was like first time doing all this kind of stuff. Plus, like if you're doing something like innovative, then you're going to come across, especially in some of these like these cutting edge sectors, kind of like you were doing at Thoughtful as well. It's like you're coming across all these different these new kind of situations where you just have to learn on the fly. Like even if you had experience being CEO at another place before, like you're encountering something brand new. So it's like part of the job description is like you need to know how to learn and self-learn, be okay with not being the best at something, because like it definitely in my case been like it's like before I operate, I need to make sure being like, okay, quickly learn, figure out exactly what you need to do for the situation, and then execute. The execution part is the easy part. It's the I find it's the learning part that takes the most time oftentimes, and it's always constantly changing.
You touch on something that that is pretty important in my opinion when we look at a COO role, right? Is that it's unique, and if you put myself in a different organization, I'll be a totally different person, and I may or may not succeed, even if I have succeeded, multiple times over in previous roles as well. And you oftentimes also talk about like dynamics with the CEO and the dynamics between the strength of the team as well, right? The composition of the team that you had at that point of time. So you mentioned, Chris, you've been with him for 9 years, right? And I'm curious in terms of like, how do you then work out dynamics across the years, right? Because I'm sure it has now from you started as friends, then you throw in the professional aspect, right? So how do you then work out that I guess being able to kind of maintain objectivity, professionalism, and then we are all humans. Friendship is important. So I'm curious in terms of how did you manage this with Chris over time as well, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, especially for how long we've been doing it as well. It's like it's a relationship, right? It's not just like a work. It's a full on relationship. It's like a marriage in that sense. We've been together for quite some time. Just like any other relationship, it goes up and down, right? Sometimes you end up like super aligned. Sometimes you end up in like you take things for granted in terms of alignment. Like even at work, let's say sometimes I remember like early on we wouldn't have like a necessary cadence in terms of like meeting up. We would chat a bit, and then sometimes we end up working on our separate stuff because there's just so much to do. You end up like zoning out and siloing up for like 2 months, and then realize, oh my God, we're a bit like unsynced right now. How do we get through there? So, and we've definitely made our mistakes in terms of like the not syncing up. But one of the things that we've gotten way better, especially over the last year, now that especially since we're remote, we had to do it. and also not only remote but also async because different time
Yeah.
zones completely flip. So
Mm.
Chris splits his time between Boston and Taipei. I'm mostly based in North America, so we set up like our cadence being like we have two weekly meetings, one on Sunday nights right before the start of the week, and then one midweek just after this call. Actually, I'm going to have one as well, and it's like being able to sync where we set like an hour where we don't have a necessary agenda yet, and we just block those off and we do it every year. Doesn't matter if we don't have anything to talk about, we still get on there and something will naturally come up, and that way we're always in sync, and it's been night and day since then, in terms of like our efficacy as a team and as leadership in our organization. And it's like, but you got to go through it. It's hard to schedule those in, but it's been super important, and it's been great so far. Yeah.
Right. And you gotta stick to it, right? You gotta honor it, right? Because it's one thing to schedule it, it's another thing to show up, right? So I think it's important that once you've got those time in to sync up, you show up. And like you say, right, regardless of whether you've got anything to talk about, regardless of how important other things may seem to be at that point of time, unless it's really life and death situation, you show up, right? So I think those kind of cadences definitely helps as well. I think you talk about how like you can go silo for 2 months, right? Which is not ideal, obviously, at that point of time. But we have to work closely with various departments, right? So even though it may appear that you're in silo, but you have various touch points as well. Talk to me a little bit about, I guess, cross-functional collaboration, and how do you actually like facilitate like effective communication between different teams as well, right? Because I think that's one of the main roles of a COO, to really, because you have the vision of how do we then execute the big picture in that sense, right? So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, one thing that's been good about like especially with our team is like both Chris and I are heavily involved in the communication aspect. Even sometimes, probably even more Chris in certain times, because not only on our team did we have the just like the standard work relationship, but also there's differences not only in departments but also in cultures as well. So I'm North American coming into Taipei, all Chinese speaking. Thankfully, most of or pretty much all our employees can speak English, but like still Chinese is their preferred language. And Chris, obviously, I've failed multiple times at being efficient in Chinese. But like oftentimes Chris would take that lead in terms of getting in detail and figuring out exactly what's going on. So like we've had to deal with all these different kind of elements, even in our time in Ethiopia, like language, culture, even now. I mean, everyone kind of deals with this now, but with the idea of like remote work, and thankfully with COVID has been great because everyone has experienced remote. So and everyone's been kind of sharing their learnings as well. So that's been quite key for our transition into going remote and async in like completely 12-hour different schedules as well. So being able to learn from other founders, and like I've made the mistake. I used to go out to my network and ask them like, okay, like we've previously talked about like, okay, who do we ask for advice? Like, do we go to see another COO and stuff?
Yeah.
I've realized at this point, and like, I don't even bother going to ask other COs. I ask them for like strategics on like how do they manage their day to day. But in terms of like specific sectors, I go find a specialist in this one versus another one, because like I've made the mistake of going to like top CEOs for like large organizations of like hundreds, thousands of employees, and their problems and the way they work is like they're like, you need to be efficient delegators, and I look around my office and I'm like, I'm delegating to myself here. Like, so it's such a difference when you're in that startup phase. So
Yeah, for sure. I feel like the it's easier said than done, but I really think that one statement remains true, is that the moment you kind of move into such a role, right, and in the context of being in a startup, in a smaller startup setup, for example, you kind of really need to find people that are in this phase as well, because I think at the end of the day, your corporate friends, for example, love them to bits, but they just can't relate to what you're doing. And their advice will ring hollow and in on many occasions, and it's so tough because as COO, I think another challenge is really that there are so many times where you just can't share, right? Because it's not right to share, and because you cannot share, when you go and let's say, like, for example, we meet, for example, I'm sure there are a lot of things that we cannot talk about, and therefore it becomes therapy by just talking about very surface level stuff, right? And sometimes perhaps that's good enough. I don't know what your experience is like as well.
No, I totally agree. Exactly the same thing as well. Um, yeah, it's really interesting because in our team, not only the culture aspect, but yeah, it's quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. The in terms of um, I guess hard learned lessons as COO, right? If you need to, I guess, write a blog post about it. Let's not talk about a book yet, right? Let's talk about a blog post. Number one mistake not to repeat, or two mistakes that you not to repeat. Right? What would it be?
Okay, so if I was writing a blog, I think that, like, first, I guess the title of the piece to me, uh, it, if I were writing to like other future people considering
Yeah,
in, let's say, in very much our sector, like 3A health
yeah,
technology sector,
yeah.
I'd
Send
be
it.
my
It's
title
an
my
email
title
sent
would
sent to
be,
them, right? Yeah.
yeah, my subject line would be, you can't do everything, and it's okay. That's what it would be, because, like, the reality is dealing with, I mean, a lot of what we do, especially in the COO side, is very reactive. It's not like product development, or like as an engineer, where you have your goals, you have your scrums, you have all your different engineering cycles, and then you can just execute from there. It's like a lot of the stuff that we deal with, we try to plan ahead of time, but it's very reactive in a lot of situations. Something happens, and you spend, like, your entire day schedule is ruined, and you just got to deal with it, and no one notices at the end. You did all this work, so it's like, you don't get a lot of shine, that's for sure. That's why. And then the other thing is, yeah, there's so much stuff that, and especially, I'm thinking, especially for myself, and like, I end up having so many things on my list that I need to do, and what ends up becoming super important is triaging the tasks, according to, like, focusing on tasks on the tasks, on tackling the most mission critical items is what I think is the most important. And I've had to learn this the hard way. Like, I used to do whatever something would come up, and I'd get distracted, and some new email would come up, and I'd jump to this, I'd jump to that, and the switching cost of different sectors, because you have to wear so many different hats as a CEO. Switching cost is real, and you spend so much time focusing on one, and just jumping in from, like, a finance task to jumping over to a legal one. It takes a real amount of brain power and effort and energy to do that. So I try to limit now the amount of switching costs. So, like, I'll have my email blurbs during the day, and I'll read through all my emails, and I won't even answer them all, and I'll triage them, and then I'll say, okay, my morning is just going to be all legal stuff. Then I'll have, like, contracts, and then after that, I'll schedule it out that day. I'll block out specific times to work on those items, because, like, otherwise you end up just going around and getting too distracted, and that's not productive. So, yeah, I'd say, yeah, you can't do everything, and it's okay.
I felt that when you said that. Yeah, it's real because to kind of build on that, I would say that in terms of being able to triage is important, right? You rightfully pointed out that there are you always want to do 10,000 things because you are able to see the end in mind, right? And I think one of the thing is that figuring out when to do what is the biggest problem you will have. And trust me, nobody has figured it out. But the only person that can figure it out is you. I think that will be mine, I think, right? Figuring out when to do what will be your biggest problem. Nobody has the answer but you. And that's okay as well. You know? To me, that's probably my experience. Because I came from a larger organization, I've seen how neat or how structured things can be, right? But like you said, I guess the resource constraint that we are faced at different junctures just doesn't allow for us to execute at that level. but if you enjoy figuring out stuff, this is the role for you, right? In terms of being able to kind of play within the confines. I love, like, if you give me a set of confines and let's see what we can make the most of it, I find that really, interesting and exciting as well. So if you like that, I feel like, the COO role in this kind of setup would be interesting for that kind of people, right?
I agree. I think you're right. It's like a limitation on both resources as well as time.
Yes.
And it's like both of these come in, and then you have to figure out exactly what you do. So like, I agree. So like, I've talked to many people on like large organizations, and like been able to see exactly what their processes are, and you can have the most like meticulous, like detailed work. Like even I'm thinking like on the sales side, let's say you can have the most detailed sheet, or even if you're building projections, the most detailed things. You could spend weeks on this, and in the reality, is it moving the needle for your startup? Is it taking you to the next step? Is it good enough? And then just move on to the next most mission critical item is a skill, and it's I never feel like I'm good enough at that point. I guess we'll just keep improving as we go along, right?
Yeah, if we have a combined blog post or email, I think the title will be "Let Go." Jordan, thank you so much for being on the show. We're kind of like close to the hour, and I really appreciate you sharing your story of your journey as well. I learned so much more, and it just makes me feel reinvigorated about the health tech space. So thank you for sharing your journey with us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. And just remember, you can't do everything.
And it's okay. Thanks, Jordan.
All right, take care.